Hello and welcome to Authors Die Twice, a podcast on video games and aesthetic theory hosted by two living failures. I'm Nathan Weinstein, and today I'm joined, as always, by someone who recently turned into a hulking beast monster, and yet he cannot stop drinking soda. It's Bryan Counter.
Hey, how's it going?
Pretty good. So Brian, you just finished Silent Hill F. I finished it about 2 weeks ago, so it's pretty fresh in our minds.
Mhm.
And we sort of wet our feet a bit in the last episode, and now I think it's time to dive just fully into spoiler territory and talk about the game as a whole. We probably won't exhaust everything. We were just chatting beforehand that we might need more episodes on Silent Hill F, just as we ended up spending a whole bunch of time on Silent Hill 2 remake. So this could also be somewhat exploratory and provisional, but I thought I'd just start by asking, you know, how your experience with the game's latter half went and what you thought of the ending.
Yeah, so I think I can't remember exactly where I had left off last time when we spoke, but I played through, I think more than the second half, right? So I think I was less than halfway through before we talked last time, and then this time I finished, I did everything else. So there's certainly a lot to talk about. I think the game gets more. It gets deeper, I think, in a few different angles, I guess. So it gets more certainly more disturbing in in really specific ways. It also there are I guess, a few new mechanics that kind of show up. Um, there's also I don't know, new questions about the identity of your main character there, and what exactly is happening, especially in the very last part of the game. There's kind of a lot of switching back and forth, and there's maybe a question of doppelgangers that I might suggest that we actually like table that for a further time, partly because I know that the successive playthroughs you get more information and more content. Um, but I actually want to start with some of the darkest stuff, I guess, because I think that really, we've spoken before about, at least I think we've spoken before about what really stays with you in a work of horror, right? If you think about, um, I oftentimes think about horror as a way of thinking about not just extremes, but about thinking through like infinity in a certain way, or thinking through like limitlessness or boundlessness. And to play a little bit kind of fast and loose with it, I won't spend too much time on it, but I see there being like there's like kind of two different versions of that, right? There's the accumulative kind of plus one infinity where you just need to always be getting one more or getting to the next thing or whatever. And I think that um, this is like the doom scrolling version of darkness, right? If you were watching through like, what's the next darkest horror movie that I could possibly watch that's more extreme or more gory or explicit or whatever, right? But then there's a kind of maybe more patient uh, version of infinity that horror can kind of get us to that, maybe for lack of a better term, this would be the good version, or the version that's a little more aesthetically coherent or something like that. And that's where I think maybe we have a lot more that's left to the imagination, and there's more uh, that's disturbing precisely because we're not shown it, right? And I think this can be literalized. Like one way that it's literalized actually comes through. And again, this is a paradox because the jump scare is maybe a version of that, like that bad horror, right? Or that kind of like, cliche in horror films or horror games. But that jump scare that I think I mentioned as looking like a kind of blank face comes to the fore really pretty specifically in the second half of the game, where you find out that kind of ends up being Hineko's like alter ego as a kind of wolf being thing, but it has no face, which I think, again, literalizes that thing. Something without a face is viscerally disturbing, so it is disturbing, but it also points to something that's just not there, right? It's just a face that isn't there. It's this kind of like scabbed over or burnt away face or whatever, and we don't really have, I think, too much of an explanation for why. I think the game would have been much less. disturbing if it was just a wolf face, or like a scary, angry looking wolf or something that would not really be successful. But having it be this otherwise kind of silly, like, oh, so I mean, I guess to back up a little bit, right? She goes through these rituals, which themselves are really disturbing, where she is made to cut off one of her arms, which is then replaced with a wolf arm. She's branded on her back, and then she has the top part of her face cut away, and this like mask is affixed permanently to her face. And then a little bit later through the game, she kind of it's again for me, it's a little bit unclear, and this is why I want to maybe pause on talking about some of this until I play through a couple more times. She has two selves, right? There are kind of two worlds that she's operating in, and this happens a lot in games. I mean, we could even talk about the hunter's dream and in Bloodborne versus what you're doing elsewhere. Um, but those two seem to kind of be meeting and then diverging and meeting again. And there's a moment where before you know that it's her doppelganger or her wolf version, her parents are kind of off screen, eviscerated by this wolf thing that has no face. And so for me, that was one of those moments where I said, whoa, it wasn't necessarily that same kind of heart racing horror that I talked about last time in terms of playing the game and really identifying with the character, but it was one of those moments that I think stayed with me because of how at least at the time, inexplicable it seemed, right? Not only because you just have killed your parents, right? You had a boss battle where you kill both of your parents and then they just walk outside somehow. It's these kind of demon or whatever forms of your parents that you defeat, and then it shows the regular parents walking outside, and this wolf thing is there, and it like reaches out its arm, and then the screen, I forget if it goes black or if it shifts up to the thing's face, and you just hear this like awful sound, right? Um, so that to me felt like a real turning point of the game, and that's after you leave Hinako's house, right? So there's a whole big section of the game where you're kind of making your way through these different versions of her house. I think there are three different versions that you kind of keep looping back, eventually to defeat her parents. So I think maybe I'll pause there because I think I just kind of set up a bunch of different things to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll jump in to say that I think the house sequence and the ritual sequences, which happen, I think, basically back to back, are my two favorite parts of the entire game.
Yeah.
Uh, and for different reasons, the house sequence, I guess there are different reasons, but they're both about a kind of replication or use the word doppelganger. Like in the house, we have this repetition of space, gradual mutation of space. Like I think one of the creepiest moments in the entire game is just when Hinako's like, "Why is this room here?" And there's not any other context or elaboration. It's just like it seems she just remarks that a room shouldn't be there in one of the versions of the house she's traversing.
Yeah.
Um, and then of course there's that room with the weird totem pole thing, which we should talk about that
Yeah,
because that's an amazing moment. But
definitely.
uh, the replication happening in the ritual sequence is like a stealth replication. As you say, it's a replication of Hinako as protagonist.
Hmm.
Um, and this is a really basic point, but it's a lot of times like the best art makes basic points or has really fundamental or simple insights, or poses really simple questions. And I think we return time and again on this podcast to questions of like identification with video game characters and the way that game characters more so than certainly than literary characters and to some extent film characters, although it gets I would want to qualify that somewhat and I don't want to derail us. Um, I'll just say provisionally that video game characters resist identification maybe more than any other medium, which is, not to repeat myself, but a paradox insofar as game characters are often seen as being like the ultimate exercise in identification.
Right.
And Silent Hill F is just a really brilliant um, and at times beautiful exploration of non-identification. to start, like we don't know why Hinako is performing these rituals. You don't know what she wants. You don't know
Right.
how much she knows or recognizes about this mystical world she keeps visiting. But even amid that uncertainty, right, we still proceed under the assumption that we're playing as the same character. So Hinako will intermittently drift out of consciousness in the the regular world of Silent Hill when she's traversing the town and a closer to real life version of reality, even though it's full of monsters and such. But then sometimes she'll drift off into this otherworldly shrine where she is engaging with an entirely different character, a character who never appears in the real, quote unquote, real Silent Hill. Um, and performing even stranger sort of acts and these mystical impossible rituals like peeling off part of her face. um, so even amid that interplay, which is one, as you say, that's quite familiar from games. A lot of games have an otherworld mechanic where you're alternating between being in one world and then in some other realm. Bloodborne does it, but God of War does it. Like platformers even do it, like kids games do it. Um, we still persist in the belief that these two characters are the same person, and that in some ways, like what's happening in the other world should eventually illuminate Hinako's decisions and desires and
Right.
intentions in the real world.
Hmm.
But as the game progresses, we learn that that's actually couldn't be further from the truth. That in fact, these two characters we've been playing as are completely different people. We're playing as doppelgangers of, two sides of Hinako's self or two different Hinakos. And they, in fact, have no overlap and become antagonists of each other as
Yeah.
the game enters its final act. And even not just are they sort of divided in terms of their intentions and desires as protagonists and antagonists, but also are staggered time-wise. So like the Hinako who is appearing, the other world Hinako is maybe seems to be a step ahead or something, or that is to say, when we're playing in the other world, we're actually playing through the past. We're not that doesn't seem to be that maybe isn't happening simultaneously with the action as it's unfolding in the present of Silent Hill. That's somewhat ambiguous, and maybe,
Yeah.
more experts can correct me on that. But my understanding was that we watch her go through all the rituals and become this monster, but when she appears in Silent Hill as an antagonist, she's like the fully developed form, like
Right.
the final form of Hinako's monster self. Um, so
Hmm.
it's somewhat similar to the movie Arrival. Have you seen Arrival
Yeah.
with Amy Adams? Where part of the great trick of that movie, spoilers for Arrival, is that we watched the whole movie thinking that what we saw in the beginning was the past, and it's not until the very end that we realize what we saw was the future. So our identification with the Amy Adams character as someone who's lived through this trauma is actually a totally false identification because it's not until the end of the movie that she gains the ability to see the future, and that therefore the montage we saw at the beginning is something that's yet to happen and yet to really inform her character that we're watching in the earlier chapters of the movie. Um, that's the case where Amy Adams, I keep saying that her name, the actor's name, because I forget what the character's name is, but
Hmm.
um, she's the same person, but she sort of has a radical transformation in her consciousness that renders her essentially a different type of being. And so we think we're watching a continuous consciousness, or identity when we're in fact watching two different identities, or at least two different identities. That at least is still two identities that are located in the same physical body. Whereas with Hinako, it's like two different bodies, or actually two physical Hinakos, even though all of this, because Silent Hill is always in some degree like a projection of the psyche of the main character, like one assumes that there is a, if we want to be really doggedly literal about it, there is a real Hinako somewhere who is dreaming of these two different Hinakos and sort of pitting them against each other in this archetypal. conflict. But we don't get to see that, and it's important that we never get to see that. Um, just like it's important that we never get to see the real James, or the James who's not in Silent Hill 2.
Yeah, I mean, this is just a side comment, but I mean, the thing that I like about Arrival that um, I don't think the same thing is happening here, but something similar is that it's like a doubling back or a way that the past is illuminated, but only through the future, right? Or it's like it's almost like the reverse of what we would usually think of as like the reveal happens in like the reverse temporal order, but it's still in a certain temporal order for us as viewers, right? And I think there is complicated stuff happening in Silent Hill F because I think there is one moment in the house where you do meet up with an identical Hinako, right? There's I think she's in her room, one of her versions of her room at one point, and she does encounter herself as herself. And that moment becomes really unclear about yeah, what is I mean, that was one of the moments that really kind of tipped me off to wondering about if there is kind of a primary of those two because I don't think there is, right? They're kind of divergent and it's unclear. I do still think that and we can talk a little bit about the ending in a bit, but I do think even though there are some kind of I won't say heavy-handed, but more telegraphed elements of the plot that come through. I do still think that there's an ultimate pointlessness to it that makes it still pretty disturbing,
Yeah.
or whatever originlessness or however we want to call it, um, because it seems to be suggested at least that at least from what I can gather, these rituals that are happening are somehow related to or suggested by Hinako's unwillingness to marry. And it seems, and again, another thing that's kind of suggested is that she's having an arranged marriage to help pay off her father's debts. So there's this kind of like related family thing of, marriage or whatever. But again, just like with James and Silent Hill 2, there's no reason that even if you don't want to be, married or whatever, that's fine. Uh, but there's no reason to suggest that becoming married has to do with cutting off your arm, having a wolf arm put on, getting branded, and then cutting your skin over your eyes and nose to permanently affix a mask. And then, because then when her sister Junko shows up, she has this really kind of disturbing, I don't know, bird mask, I guess, and so it's still pretty inscrutable and fairly bizarre. But I wonder maybe trying to think about the temporal angle again for a second, and I would need to have like a plot map, so I might be mistaken here. But after you get out of the house, and see the like the fully formed kind of wolf creature thing that kills the parents. This is before you get the cutscene where she becomes that wolf, right? So you've already seen the two Hinakos together in her room. You've already gone through the rituals, but you don't know that. I mean, for all you know, that could be just some other monster, right? Um, we did get the jump scare that I'm gonna have to go back and look at to see if that is in fact the face, the faceless thing. But there's something kind of odd about that temporally because we don't yet know that that's her, right? So there's already so within the imagined. Let me see if I can figure this out for a second. Within the imagined, if this is somehow on another plane where even both of the Hinakos that we get are not the, quote unquote real one, um, there's still a reveal. There's like still a temporal reveal. So um, it's like a nightmare within another nightmare, and eventually they kind of link up or something like that. Which is weird. I don't know that I can't think of anything else that I've played that has this element, temporally at least.
Yeah, Alan Wake 2 hasn't, it's more thematized and therefore worse. Like it's
Mm.
Alan Wake 2 has this I guess spoilers for Alan Wake 2, but it's about a doppelganger where you're locked in the cycle with your doppelganger who's like a little bit ahead of you and will kill you, but then or you kill it, but then you become it, and then the next version of you comes and kills you or something.
Mm.
Um, but it's more, it's sort of like Marvel-ified or something. I think Alan Wake 2 is a really interesting game that we should talk about because it's also a survival horror game that's very exquisitely crafted in certain ways. But in this respect, I don't think the plot is as resonant because partly because it's just spelled out a little bit more. And so yeah, I would say that I think I alluded to this on maybe it was our Christmas episode that like or maybe it was our last episode that I didn't love the ending of Silent Hill F. And I stand by that. I think it I disagree with the choice to show. Did you get the ending with like the ambulances and stuff?
Yeah, yeah.
Which is I suppose I'm wrong that actually that is our one image in the entire game of the real reality,
Yeah,
right? It's aftermath of like some kind of psychotic break that Hinako seems to have experienced because she's taking these red and
yeah.
white pills. So there's a kind of goofy, like, don't do drugs element to the game too, where it's like, and then to like get the later endings, you have to not take the pills because the pills are bad for Hinako,
Yeah.
that you've been popping the whole game. Although they are not as effective as soda, which is important, or candy. Um, but so I would say that's a bit of in my mind, that's a bit of a misstep, or rather, like I, I think the game would be stronger if it didn't spell things out so firmly. And I will say that that is one. My understanding of the game's ending structure is that that's one of several possible futures, and that other endings you get they don't start from that as the or preordained outcome. They actually offer suggested other outcomes that Hinako might have, and they don't, I think. I watched sort of I watched a YouTube video that had I sort of skimmed through some of the other endings, and as far as I remember, they don't actually depict something like the core baseline reality of the Silent Hill F world in the way that this one does. You were about to say something.
Yeah, I mean a few things. I'll try to remember everything. I mean, one, I agree. I thought the end that ending was a little bit corny, because yeah, it's like this police correspondence where she murdered a bunch of people at a wedding, right? Or something like that.
Yeah,
Um, and it's because she's taking these pills. Now, I think the fact that it's like a drug-induced psychosis or whatever, I will forgive that because I do think there's still a kind of senselessness to that. There's like I like that more than cult explanation, for
yeah,
example, Um, but I do, in my, typical fashion, I'll try to imagine an ending that I would have liked more. I mean, I think an ending that kind of conveys the drug nature of it without her having killed a bunch of people might have been a little more interesting, because the implication then is that she's gone, through all these like psychic torture basically going through Silent Hill in this way. And then she killed people and now she's just gonna like go to jail or something like that, which is
yeah,
kind of that's banal. But if we leave her still in the middle of that cycle or there's a little bit of indeterminacy about what happens to her, I feel like that might have been a more satisfying ending. One thing that I want to like mention right now though, because I don't want to forget it, is that in the very end of the game, and we can also talk more about this, but when you're switching back and forth very like pretty quickly between the two Hinakos and you just keep picking up pills off the ground, I was counting like trying to pay attention to how many you started with each time you switched, and you would start at a lower like you would start over at like 99 or something like that each time you switched. And so there's even, those jumping between times, there's an implied either time gap or consumption of more pills or what, because I wasn't taking any of them. I was just picking up, 20 or something, and I had like 120. And then the next time I would switch and start over, and I would have like 99 again, and then I would have 120, then I would switch and start over and have. So it's not as if you're even jumping between just one or the other at that point. I think it's unclear whether you're jumping between the two Hinakos or something else is happening entirely. So that I think that last part ends up being really interesting because it becomes totally unmoored from even the baseline already pretty compromised reality that you have for most of the game.
Yeah, that's a great point about the pills and the sort of implied either time reversion or consumption of the pills. Like,
Mm,
either one seems like a plausible explanation. But I guess yeah, I agree. And I would say that the part of what's mildly frustrating about the ending is that they had it right there. Because I think that moment during the pill
yeah,
sequence, I almost want to call it the pill montage, even though it's not a montage, strictly speaking, where you're traversing versions of the game's environments, but there are pills everywhere.
yeah,
Uh, is it true that towards the end you start to hear sirens, but you're still in the fantasy world of the game? And that
I
I
think
think
so.
I
Yeah,
have a memory of that happening. Maybe it's a false memory. If that's true, I mean, I think that's just a totally brilliant move. That in fact, you know, what could be, you're at a point of like ultimate escalation, like
yeah,
your doppelganger has literally crushed your parents' heads with her bare hands into
yeah,
pulp, you know, and the thing that can actually break through the noise and totally change the equation is the sort of eruption of everyday reality, which is exactly how it works in Silent Hill 2. Like at the core, again, at the dark heart of Silent Hill 2, we see a video that's about like a hospice stay, essentially,
yeah.
that it's not about monsters.
Hmm.
Um, and that the sirens bursting in is just so uncanny precisely because of the dissonance between, which we discussed previously, like between, um, yeah, what did I call it? Like the quotidian as the terror of the quotidian and the quotidian aspect of terror or something like that.
Yeah, yeah,
But it reminds me of, I guess I'm just on spoiler. I'm on a spoiler spree right now because another game that we've sort of mentioned in passing off the pod is Returnal, and Returnal does something really similar and really brilliant where I won't say too much because I think we may play it eventually, but um, I have I say this in a review I wrote years ago, but it's a game of specifically like Lovecraftian Eldritch influence. But in fact, the most Eldritch site after you've traversed this planet of like, ancient temples and like unspeakable beings is the site of a regular ass sedan lying at the bottom of a lake with its
yeah,
headlights on. And like the headlights on implying that it drove off something and shouldn't be in the water. Even a car in water is already disturbing, but a car with its lights on is even more disturbing.
mhm,
Um, and it's just an utterly bracing and arresting and sublime moment of visual storytelling that's never quite explained. And so I see the sirens at the end of Silent Hill F as doing something similar and similarly effective. The disappointment is that then we get the actual scene of the crime or
yeah,
whatever.
yeah,
Um, but that's such a small, in my mind, such a small misstep in the grand scheme of things. And I
yeah.
want to, now that I've complained a little bit, I want to highlight two things that really, really work for me in the game's final act, which is again, I mean, just sort of taking up your point about like ultimate unknowability or opacity. They're both points of resistance or confusion,
Mm,
So. And I want to say they map onto the two different Hinakos. Like each Hinako experiences one contradiction that is never, in my memory, resolved. Um, for Beast Hinako, or the Hinako who undergoes the rituals, um, it strikes me as a little bit dissonant, but in a paradoxical and powerful and interesting way that that's the version of Hinako that kills her parents.
mhm,
Precisely because by agreeing to the arranged marriage, you would think she's embracing the version, of
right.
herself that her parents desire.
Yeah.
Whereas it's the other Hinako who says, like, you took everything away from me, you destroyed my life, that would seem to have true bitterness at her parents. And in fact, there's that moment in her house, I think, when you read her diary, and it has this like very banal and very almost cheesy, but cheesy in the Lynchian way where it cuts to something so fucking real that it's bracing,
Mhm.
where she says like, I get so mad at my parents, I wish I could turn into a monster and rip them apart,
Yeah.
you know? And it's like, holy fuck, like that's what the game, at that point, I was like, that's what this game is about. She's like voluntarily undergoing, she's voluntarily abandoning her friends and undergoing these rituals so that because she knows she's going to kill her parents and is sort of like saying goodbye to her life.
Yeah.
That's actually not what the game is about. And in fact, it's the opposite. It's the other Hinako, who kills the parents. So that's contradiction number one. Good
Mhm.
contradiction one. Good contradiction number two, which is even better, is that regular Hinako or Hinako of Silent Hill, the town, has no memory of Fox Mask.
Right.
That is so incredible, man. Like the basically, I think I went on Reddit, I went on Wikipedia, I read explainers of the story, so I'm getting this secondhand. But um, I think the suggestion is that Fox Mask is the fantasy version of the boy who she has an arranged marriage with.
Yeah.
So you would think, therefore, that real, Silent Hill, I'm going to call her Silent Hill Hinako as opposed to Otherworld Hinako. Silent Hill Hinako should know exactly who this guy is. And in fact, it's implied that they had some encounter as children where she saved him from a fox bite or something at a playground.
Yeah.
But when she's confronted with this memory, she's like, I don't remember any of this,
Right.
you know? And so it may be a very simplistic and crude modeling of repression or something, but the way it actually manifests within you know, the temporality of playing the game is so enigmatic
Hmm.
and so interesting and really, really powerful to me. It's like those two plots never join because Fox Mask never appears for the real Hinako, or for the real world Hinako.
Yeah, and there's even I think it might be the moment where the two Hinakos are together in her room. The the doppelganger one even admonishes her at acting like she doesn't know what's going on, right? So there's this kind of like I mean, obviously there's a tension between the two selves, but it's made explicit in this uh, speech, I guess, or whatever, this exchange that they have. Um,
Yeah.
I wanted one thing, the thing about Returnal, which I haven't played, but I remember actually that in your essay that mentioning that part with the car at the bottom of the water or whatever. I mean, I kind of think that weird eye, monster thing with the eye or that whatever it is, it's like a big wooden uh I kind of don't want to know what it is because I've looked online and I've seen kind of conflicting things about it, and I think none of them are really sufficient, and I prefer to keep it unknown. But it's in the very center of the houses, right? Or it's in the very center of the versions of the house. It's like this weird room that you just walk into, and it's kind of jutting across like diagonally the room, and it's watching you with this yellow eye. And if you interact with it, Hinako just says, "I should leave right away." And there
So
are all these, like, I don't know what they were supposed to be. There are all these either bottles or little versions of itself all over the floor. And I kind of want to say that is like the actually one of the most uncanny, maybe the most uncanny or most disturbing moment because within the complex and, generally pretty terrifying world of the game, it's a moment of like true negativity because it's this benign thing that you can't really do anything to. It's not trying to kill you. You can't kill it, but you want to get away from it, even though there's no gameplay reason for doing so. Um, and so there's something about, that I like stood there looking at it, when I played, stood there in that room just kind of wondering about it for I think a few minutes because was so unexpected. It has nothing to do with I mean, I'm sure there's going to be eventually some explanation on a subsequent playthrough, but as far as I know right now, there's no explanation for what that could be other than, I mean, the only thing that I would think of is that it has something to do with her father because her father seems like the real antagonist in the game. Um, and my first thought was, is this her father who had like turned himself into like a bottle of alcohol or something like that? Because you keep finding these bottles all over the house. But I don't know that that's what it is. And I also think that it would be better if it was just something that you could never really understand.
yeah,
Um,
that moment is utterly amazing. And I haven't even looked up an explainer. I like don't want to know find an explainer, and I'm glad to hear that they seem insufficient because
yeah.
in my playthrough, I just there was no context. It wasn't like it was a bottle of pills with an eyeball, or it
Mm.
was this weird like it's like a totem or
Yeah,
something
yeah. You know what?
throughout the room and is far exceeds the room. I'm thinking of like the the John Silence story we read
Yeah, yeah.
earlier, although this is a physical mass, but it's like
Right,
the physical mass just in a way where it's like, well, where is the rest of it? Where could even the rest of it be?
right.
Sorry, what were you gonna say?
Well, I was just going to say too that it strikes me that as we've discussed before, that feels like a thing that's really in pain as well. Like it's
Yeah.
just looking at it follows you if you move around, but it just has an eye and it like can't communicate with you and you just need to flee from it, but it just feels like a moment of like real sorrow, you know?
And as I remember, that eye is not looking particularly good.
No.
Like it should probably get checked out or something. I forget exactly the signs of malignancy in the eye, but it's not the most
Yeah,
healthy
definitely.
eye. But the you know, you mentioned like part of why this moment works so well is exactly what you said. Gameplay wise, there's no threat whatsoever. And it's
Yeah.
precisely when there's no gameplay threat that Hinako seems actually disturbed
Yeah.
for once. Because as you said, she never reacts. She's totally unfazed by monsters, like James in Silent Hill 2. But for some reason, she enters this room and she doesn't shake, she doesn't have palpitations, or her vision doesn't get blurry, but she says it's much more effective because her performance, and I think her performance is amazing from the motion capture artist, actor and um I played on Japanese, but just like the work with Hinako as a character, I think is really good. Um, she like she's such an understated, non-emotive character that when she says like I shouldn't be in here, like
Yeah.
it's so scary.
I think it's also important that there's not a cut scene, right? I mean, if there
Yeah.
was some kind of cut scene, even if it was just her looking disturbed, I think that would kind of
Yeah.
ruin it, Yeah, this may be a tangent, so I don't know, but I think, or whatever, we've raised the question, I think, with several games about tone and, I guess relatedly atmosphere. And I think with this game we have a really oddly the maybe the closest thing I can think of is some in literature at least is some of Cormac McCarthy's novels where we have like truly, truly disturbing things happening, but then moments that are relatively like okay, or at least a moment of repose that still seem kind of suffused with this real dread. Um, there's a particular, I won't get into it, but there's a particular moment in Outer Dark where, which is just a terrifying, no, terrifying novel. And there's a moment that is actually kind of a moment of rest, but the way that it's written, because of everything that's come up before it and because of everything that happens afterwards, uh, it's almost like it's almost like this moment where there's something uncertain about the scenario where someone may be in danger, but they ultimately are not.
Mhm.
Uh,
Mhm.
and I think that, having kind of this, other than her saying, I should leave right away or whatever, that's the only thing that we get about this. A boss health bar doesn't pop up, nothing starts moving, right? Like her health bar doesn't pop up, nothing. It's just her saying, I should leave right away. That seems to me like the most, yeah, in a way, like doomed kind of response to that thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it strikes me now, it's kind of like environmental storytelling, to use the sort of trendy term,
Mhm.
a term that I'm not professionally committed to, I have to say, but like it's the environmental storytelling version of that thing that you mentioned like way, way back at the beginning, one of the earliest, maybe the first episode of this podcast about how, I think we talked about how, you know, apropos of like Souls games that sometimes have a glitched out or incomplete area with a door that you can't open.
Mhm.
That games should in fact always have one door that you can't open because it makes them feel more expansive and deeper and more interesting. And
Yeah.
this is like the environmental storytelling version of that. It's like uh it's not the it's precisely a door that you can open. You can go in there, but it's a room that you're just like, can I even interact with this room? Is there some significance to the room? Is this room completely extraneous, like what is the point of this?
Well, it's a room that's like completely full and completely empty at the same time because you don't need to go in that room at all. There's
Yeah,
no
that's
you don't
beautiful.
you don't get anything out of it, right? But it's filled with this uh yeah, just horrifying and contextually horrifying, right? It's not objectively, I mean, that is objectively horrifying. I'll take that back. But it's not like the most hideous monster you've ever seen. It's this kind of
Yeah.
pitiful looking, yeah, again, totem pole, I guess, with an eye that follows you around that your character says that you need to leave, you
Yeah.
know, and there's nothing else to it.
Yeah, I love that at once. You said at once full and empty at the same time. And
Mhm.
that does again remind me of Asphodelius,
Yeah, yeah,
Algernon Blackwood's story that we discussed
right.
before, which is another kind of like impossible fullness of this entity who fills the entire space, but fills it as air would fill it, like in an invisible, immaterial way.
Yeah.
You know, yeah, I actually think those two, that moment and something in Blackwood would be a really interesting companion, or pairing to think about at more length.
Yeah, I think so too.
Should we wrap here?
Sure. I think that's good.
So I guess we definitely have a lot more Silent Hill F to get
Yes.
to. And we haven't even talked about Madness yet.
Yeah.
The
Or
sort
or the way that what happens with the friends. I think we
yeah,
could do a whole, I mean, I have a lot of thoughts about that too, but we can save that for another time.
yeah. Sounds good.
Sounds good. Well, if you are in the is it the ritual halls or whatever it is, the temple, um, you need to find your way. You're kind of walking through these those kind of arches. You're trying to catch up with Fox Mask so you guys can finally get married. You might not be able to light it yourself, but you have to keep an eye out for the magic lanterns that are lit along the ground.
Thanks, Brian.